My lathe is old, very old, on the order of 100 years old. This lathe was manufactured about the same time that the Wright brothers were making their first flights. But it still works, it's still serviceable. It doesn't have a lot of adjustments and it doesn't do a lot of things that nice modern lathes do. But it works pretty well and is what I have to use. I understand this lathe was used by a model maker, a person who had it before me, who made lots of models that went into museums of big battleships and things like that. Anyway, I've got my piece of copper here. I've got some layout marks on it. This is not the original chuck that the lathe would have come with. I don't think three-jaw chucks existed at that time. They may have, I don't know. But this lathe typically would have used some lathe dogs. I've taken a piece of high-speed steel and ground it to the angle I want for the cuts. So we're going to take a facing cut on the surface, and then we're going to come back and we're going to put in the hammer head design. Copper. This is just one of many ways to make a handle. I do not own a wood lathe. The only lathe I have is my 1912 cast early lathe, antique lathe I guess would be a better choice. And it gets pressed into service for an awful lot of things, and in this case I'm going to press it into service as a wood lathe. I also happen to only own one lathe tool, so that is my tool of choice and the tool I use for everything. And I'm going to cut down a handle on the lathe using the tool. I don't have a steady rest for cutting wood, so I have to use the tool holder for my regular tools and just move it as necessary to make the cutting. What I did do, however, was to make a template that I can use to gauge the shape of the cuts I want to make. I'm going to use the outside caliper as I cut down to test to make sure I haven't cut down too small. And the first thing I'm going to do is make a mark about 1 inch over, which is the depth of my hammer handle, and then I'll start some cutting. I am not an expert wood turner. I at best could be only considered a rank beginner wood turner, but I'm going to give it my best shot. I'm using my other handle as a comparison just to see if I'm getting the right shape. Getting down to the end, getting pretty close, checking with the template. I like it. Might be just a little bit more taken out right through here. I think I like that a lot. A little bit of sanding, should be good to go. For the handles I made on the lathe, I'm going to flatten out the two sides to give them the oval shape, and I want to pay attention, of course, to the grain direction so that I'm not hammering in a direction that will tend to split the grain. So for this guy, we're going to sand a couple flats on it this way. So a little bit of cleanup on the sander and we'll have a nice oval shaped handle that'll fit well in your hand, so when you pick up the hammer you'll know that you've got it in the correct orientation. And after all that talking about it, I did the first one wrong. I've clearly got the handle in this oval in this direction, which means that I'm going to be hammering on the long grain of the wood, the year-to-year growth rings, and run a risk of breaking it. So what we've got to do is get the flats filed parallel with the grain so that you've got the non-splitting grain in the handle in the striking direction. I'll see if I can get it right now. There's many ways to fit the tenon on the end of the handle into the hammer. You can saw it and sand it, you can carve it, or you can just sand it using a little belt sander. In this case, I'm going to use this little belt sander to put a tendon on the end of this handle. I've got to be careful. This is 80 grit sandpaper. It runs pretty fast, so it tears wood off in a hurry. And I just want to get to the point where the handle just barely begins to fit into the hammer. And at that point, I'll stop and then I'll do my final fitting by hand with a emery board or a sanding block or a knife or something else to do the final fine adjustments. I decided to change the profile of my hammer handle a little bit. What I did was I thinned down this part of the handle rather than keeping it round all the way around. I think this makes it blend into the head a little bit better and doesn't stick out so far on these cheeks. Before, you had a sort of a fat part that stuck out on either side, and now I think it looks a little better. Time to finish these hammer handles. And just a quick word about finishing. When you cut on the wood, what you wind up with is some ends of some wood fibers that you've cut, and they're little pieces sticking up. And this happens when you saw or cut a piece of wood, because the wood fiber is no longer continuous. And when you put your first coat of finish on them, these little wood fibers all stand up. So what you wind up with is something that looks sort of like this, with a coating of whatever your clear finish that you put on them was, or colored finish, or whatever it might be. And you'll notice this when you feel the finish of the wood after the first coat of something. You'll feel those little pieces, those little burrs, those little fibers sticking up, and the wood will no longer be smooth like it was when you just finished sanding it. So what you do is you go back with sandpaper and you sand again, and what that does is it knocks off all these little points with a fine sandpaper. So maybe a 220 or a 320 or something like that, and you wind up with a surface like this. Now, you don't want to leave it like that because these little spots are open pores into the wood, so that's when you put a second coat of finish on, and that second coat then coats over everything and is smooth. At that point, the number of coats you apply just depends on the depth of finish you want. If you want to try and polish the handle, you'll want a little more finish so that there's some to knock off, etc. But I wanted to mention that quickly. I am a fan of polyurethane, and I'm a fan of gloss polyurethane. I think if you're going to go to the trouble to make something, you ought to be shiny. Although there are situations where I will use a non-shiny polyurethane. Give this a quick stir. This poor can of polyurethane is pretty old. It's been through a lot. And I'm just going to put a light first coat on the handle part only. So I'm not going to coat the top where the hammer head is going to go. Get a little on the end. This was sanded with 220 grit paper, so the wood was very smooth. But we're going to come back after this first coat of polyurethane dries, and you'll be able to feel all those little wood fibers that have stood up. The second coat of polyurethane has dried. The surface is shiny and smooth. Could polish it for more shininess, higher gloss, but it's a hammer after all, and you want a surface you can get a pretty good, decent grip on. I think it's time to glue on the head and fix it. I'm going to use some 5-minute epoxy to glue the head on. I'm also going to use a stainless steel nail as a wedge in the top. I'm going to drill a hole. This is a 16th inch drill. I'm going to drill a hole to guide the nail in first, and hopefully that will secure the hammer head with permanence. See if we can drill a hole first. Want to be sure to go straight. And I know I want to drill about that deep. Let's mix up a little 5-minute epoxy. Equal parts resin and hardener. I usually find about a minute of mixing time for epoxy is pretty good. Make sure that the resin and the hardener are equally and completely combined. Paper towel to remove the excess. Being careful not to spread it around too much. Now let's put in the nail using a 2-big hammer. And split the handle. Darn. Looks like I may need a little bit more hole or a little less nail. Well, the nail split the handle, and I'm not very happy about that. So I may go ahead and drill and pull this guy out and make a new handle for it. Then again, it's a pretty light-duty hammer. It doesn't have a heavy head. I may go ahead and work with it a while to see how it works out. Certainly for the other hammers, I'm going to use this as a guide and make some changes before I put the handles onto some of the other heads. Since I split the handle on the first wooden hammer putting the handle on, that made me cranky. So I had enough material left to make one additional wooden hammer. And you've heard the old expression, measure twice, cut once. Well, that presupposes you've at least measured once. So the nail is what I'm using as my wedge. And I measured it and it came out at about 110 thousandths or so. Anywhere between 106 and 113, just depending on how tight you slide the caliper. So let's call it 110. Then I measured, that was the nail, so the nail was significantly thicker than that 16th inch hole that I was drilling, which was only like about 65 thousandths. So then I found a nice drill about the right size at about 89, 90 thousandths. And so I drilled the hole in the end of the hammer with that to give a little more clearance to the nail. Let's see if I've got that quite deep enough. Yep, looks pretty good. So now what I want to do is I want to relieve this hole a little bit for the head of the nail. Let's drill that hole just a little deeper. There we go. And now I'm going to use a brad point. Get some glasses on so I can see what I'm doing, and I'm going to very carefully countersink around that hole just a little bit. Just enough to take the head of the nail. And this can be a very touchy operation because brad points can grab and all of a sudden you've drilled halfway through whatever you're drilling on. I'm going to call that about good. So now I'm ready to mount my hammerhead. And you can only push it on so far, and you don't want to pound on it. A really good way to get the handle on any hammer that you're refurbishing is to strike it on the bottom. And if you've been following along with other videos, you know we made these great wooden mallets, and so all we have to do is give it a couple of pops on the bottom. And just the inertia of the head and the shock in the handle causes the head to remain stationary while the handle works its way up in. So that looks pretty good. I'm going to try and remove this. I'm going to mix up a little bit of epoxy, and then I'm going to glue it together, and we're going to try and put a nail in it. So, the hammer journey comes to an end. We started out with just a plain wooden hammer. Just a little tap-tap hammer, nothing heavy-duty. You're not going to use any of these hammers to really pound on something. And, of course, we have the one where I cracked the handle and had to go again. But the second one was a success after we did a little measuring. So it turned out pretty nice. Nice little hammer. The reason that all of this started is copper. The copper cut nicely on the lathe, but boring and using an end mill on the slot in the top was very difficult. I think it's because the copper is so soft, the chips did not come out of the hole. They sort of curled back underneath the end mill. So it made a really rough finish on the internal surface. The chips didn't come out. It didn't want to machine. It was rough. Copper was surprisingly difficult to machine, so that was that. But copper will make a nice hammer for tapping in things like drive rivets. It's a lot softer than brass, so if something is going to be marred, it's going to be the face of the copper and not the face of the material you're working on. So that's the hammer story. I think I've got 12 different hammers here, and I think I probably have a hammer for just about anything you could imagine. I think I've used up almost all the materials in the world, maybe except for titanium.